Is Chinese difficult to learn, even impossible? Or is it in fact quite easy? The answer is that learning Chinese is difficult, but not in the way most people think. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. Today we are going to talk about one of the most common questions I get asked about learning Chinese, and if you have been learning Chinese for some time, you have probably been asked this question many times, and of course you have probably asked it yourself as well, especially before you started learning. Is Chinese really as difficult as people say? And in this episode I'm going to discuss the question of difficulty when it comes to learning Chinese. I'm not going to give a number from 1 to 10 how hard Chinese is and then try to compare that to other languages. I think such a rating is completely pointless, as it depends on so many other things, such as what your native language is and what other languages you've learned and so on. However, I have thought a lot about the question of difficulty, and it is one that gets asked a lot, like I said, and it's also one that gets answered a lot online, and so I think I have some insights when it comes to in what way Chinese is difficult and how that influences the way you learn and the methods that you choose. Before we get to that though, I'd like to return to what I said about rating language difficulty as being rather pointless, and many people have argued this, that there is no point in saying that Chinese is super hard or super easy, or that Japanese is harder or easier or anything like that, because for most people who are learning the language already, it doesn't really matter. If I were to say that, say, Korean is slightly easier or harder than learning Chinese, would that then make you switch languages? That seems highly unlikely. And if you're not learning Chinese already, it seems a bit weird to choose language based on how difficult it is. I mean, sure, this can be something that you factor in, but if you're considering learning Chinese and listening to this podcast, I think you already have an interest in Chinese language and culture, and so it doesn't make much sense to choose another language just because someone thinks it's generally speaking easier. And if you were to choose the easiest language, you should probably choose something like Dutch, Swedish, or maybe Spanish, not Chinese. There are also many individual factors that go beyond what any kind of general classification can describe. So if you have a very strong interest and you have good opportunities to learn a language, well, then that can make that language easier to learn regardless of the inherent difficulty of the language itself, even when compared with, say, your native language or other languages that you know. So in general, I don't think it's very interesting to discuss exactly how difficult Chinese is to learn, because this question is fraught with problems, as I've just said. But that doesn't mean there is nothing interesting to say about the difficulty when it comes to learning Chinese, because I do think there are some things that can have an impact on the way you learn, as I said in the introduction, and that's what I want to discuss in this episode. For example, I try to have an optimistic but yet realistic approach to things that I do, and I think this realism is important because it tells you a lot about what kind of expectations you should have on your learning. So if someone were to fool you into believing that learning Chinese is really easy, then I think you would be disappointed rather quickly, and you might conclude that there's something wrong with you because you thought this was supposed to be easy and now it turns out it's actually quite hard, and the obvious conclusion to draw from that is that, well, you are probably not smart enough, not talented enough, or something else, and then you will quit learning Chinese and do something else. However, I don't think there is much point in being needlessly pessimistic either. Chinese isn't impossible to learn for an adult foreigner. I started learning when I was in my mid-20s, and I've met people who started learning much later than that and still were able to reach their goals. That doesn't mean it was easy though, and as most listeners can probably attest, learning Chinese comes with several challenges. Most of these are relative rather than absolute, meaning that it's nothing with the Chinese language itself that makes it hard, but rather the relationship between Chinese and other languages that you speak. Or to be more precise, the lack of a relationship between languages you know and Chinese. The reason it's easy to learn, say, Swedish as a native speaker of English is not that Swedish is inherently easy, it's just that there's so much overlap in terms of grammar and vocabulary and culture and so on that the step from English to Swedish is rather small. To further illustrate this point, we can think of native speakers of Chinese trying to learn English, well, or Swedish or some other Indo-European language, as adults. Mastering things such as tenses, articles, and plurals in English when you come from a language background that doesn't care about any of these things is very difficult, which becomes apparent when you speak with Chinese people in English. Naturally, just as it isn't impossible for us to learn Chinese as adults, it isn't impossible for Chinese people to learn English as adults either, but it is comparably difficult. So the difficulty here comes from the lack of overlap in areas such as grammar, vocabulary, and culture. And since you can go in both directions, from Chinese to English and from English to Chinese, it follows that the overlap is of course the same in both directions, and so they should be roughly on a comparable difficulty level. Then we also have some things that make Chinese difficult to learn in absolute terms. So that would be without including or taking into consideration what languages you know in advance. The most obvious example of this is, of course, the Chinese writing system, which is much harder to learn than any system that relies on phonetic writing that has an alphabet, in other words. Yes, English spelling is really weird, and when you learn some languages, you need to learn a new alphabet, and in languages like Arabic, the letters change shape depending on where they are in words and so on. But nothing of this compares to learning thousands of Chinese characters to be able to read and write. We talked more about the challenges of learning the writing system in episode 67 if you want to check that out. Then there are also other aspects of learning Chinese that are difficult, not necessarily the most difficult, but still more difficult than you might expect, such as listening ability, which is difficult for several reasons, something we covered in episode 35. So far, we've talked about things that increase the difficulty of learning Chinese, but there are of course also things that decrease the difficulty. You don't have to browse online for very long to find claims of Chinese being easier to learn than most people think, or actually quite easy. So what's up with these claims then? Are they just sales pitches for products that hope to fool you into thinking that learning Chinese is easy so they can earn some quick money off you? Well, yes, in many cases, and as John Paston once said, if somebody claims that Chinese is easy to learn, they are probably trying to sell something to you. However, I don't think that's what's going on all the time, and I actually wrote an article about why Chinese is easier than you think, and it's one of the earliest articles on hacking Chinese. I wrote that article 6 years before there was anything to purchase at all on the website, so it clearly wasn't a sales pitch, but rather an attempt to counter the claims that learning Chinese is impossible. And I also don't think, like I said, that it pays much to be overly pessimistic, so focusing on all the very difficult things as you start learning doesn't really help. So I think it's worth to point out things that actually are rather easy in Chinese, at least as a beginner. Note that the claim here isn't that Chinese is easy to learn as a whole, but rather that there are some aspects of Chinese that are rather easy. Because it is true, when you learn Chinese, you don't need to worry about inflecting verbs in 5 tenses or learning different genders and so on. I do believe that a desire to counter this Chinese is impossible to learn idea lies behind many of the YouTube videos and articles and so on claiming that Chinese is easy, rather than necessarily being a sales pitch for something. I think this is enough of an introduction to get to what I actually want to talk about in this episode, which is the way in which Chinese is difficult. Because when we talk about something being difficult in everyday language, we usually think we know what we mean, but I will show that there are actually 2 distinct types of difficulty, and that it can help to understand one situation better if we make a distinction between these 2 types. I also think that this can clear up some of the seeming disagreements between people who on the one hand claims that Chinese is really hard to learn, and some people who say, well, it's not that bad. And maybe this is because they are actually talking about different things. So let me introduce vertical and horizontal difficulty. Vertical difficulty is when each step you take is difficult, and I think this is what most people think of when they say that something is difficult. When something is vertically difficult, it means that success isn't necessarily guaranteed just because you try many times, and a more qualitative change might be necessary for you to make progress. So let's look at climbing as an example, which obviously isn't related to learning Chinese, but is where the vertical comes from. I've tried bouldering and indoor climbing many times, and even though I might meet the physical requirements, if I try a difficult course, I simply won't succeed even if I try a dozen or even 100 times. To succeed, I would need to obtain completely new skills. I might need to have a specific method for practicing or have someone who points out what I'm doing wrong and things like that. And simply trying more doesn't guarantee that I will succeed. When it comes to vertical difficulty, if you fail, it's because a specific step was simply too difficult and you didn't have the skills necessary to take it. Horizontal difficulty is very different. It's when each step is easy, but the total number of steps is what makes the activity difficult. This is usually when you need to do the same things over and over for a long period of time. Success requires grit and persistence, but provided that you don't give up, you will get there in the end. A good example of this is walking 1,000 miles, which most people won't fail because a certain literal step along the way was too difficult, but because there are too many steps to take in total. Walking, or maybe long-distance running, is of course where I got the horizontal idea from. You will succeed if you persist, and doing more of the same will bring you closer to your goal. If you fail, it will be because there are too many steps in total, not because a single specific step was too hard. So these are two types of difficulty, and they are of course both difficult, that goes without saying, but I think we can agree that they are difficult in different ways. Naturally, no activities have purely vertical difficulty, not even climbing, and no activities have perfectly horizontal difficulty either, not even walking. So this is more of a spectrum, or maybe a slope with varying steepness. Now that we have talked about vertical and horizontal difficulty, we are ready to discuss the question in the title of this episode: Is Chinese difficult to learn? The answer is yes, but let's use what we have discussed so far to go a little bit further than that and look at in what ways different aspects of learning Chinese are difficult. So let's start with some things that have vertical difficulty, and so that would be the type of difficulty that most people think about when they say that Chinese is difficult. So the first one is learning basic pronunciation and tones. This is a good example because simply trying a lot and speaking a lot doesn't necessarily guarantee that your pronunciation will be good. In fact, I would say that most adults who don't pay specific attention to pronunciation in itself won't learn to pronounce the language very well. It's a good example for when qualitatively different practice methods might be necessary, and if this is something you're interested in, I have tons of episodes and articles about pronunciation, and you can also check out my pronunciation course at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. The next vertically difficult aspect of learning Chinese I've chosen as an example here is understanding Chinese characters. Or rather, understanding the writing system. So not individual or even a large number of characters, but getting the hang of how Chinese characters are structured, understanding how components work and how they fit together, and so on. These things are vertically difficult for beginners before you get into it and before you've learned maybe a few hundred characters. There's a whole series of articles and episodes about that, starting in episode 54 if you are interested. The last example I want to bring up of vertical difficulty is handwriting for beginners. Because there are so many rules and conventions and things you need to know that you simply don't know, and just writing here won't necessarily help you, you need to understand what you're doing, you need to learn these rules and conventions over time, but then after you've done this for a while, the slope becomes less and less steep, and you know how to learn characters, and it turns into a more horizontally difficult task. And this is a good segue into the next set of examples, which will then be about horizontal difficulty. The most obvious example is learning thousands of characters. So even if learning your first characters will entail learning lots about the language, the writing system, how characters are composed, and there's lots of vertical difficulty there. But if you've learned, say, 1,000 character, learning character number 1001 is not very hard, and neither is learning character 1002. And not even character 2000 or 3000 are particularly difficult to learn, it's just that there are so many of them, and this is a perfect example then of horizontal difficulty. Each step is easy, but the difficulty comes from having lots of steps to take. Another example of horizontal difficulty would be collocations, and that's which words tend to go with which other words. So for example, in English we say it's sunny, but in Chinese you say that the sun is big, 太阳很大. And this is just something you need to learn. And the rain is also big. We say 雨很大 to say that it rains a lot. And you just need to learn that that's the way you say it. And if you need to learn thousands or even tens of thousands of words in Chinese, it follows then that the number of combinations of these words that you need to learn to be able to say all these things is astronomical. This is maybe an even better example of horizontal difficulty, because learning one of these is trivial. You might not even realize it because you've just seen or heard it many times. But there are so many of them, and it requires an extraordinary amount of listening and reading to learn them. That brings us to the third and final example in this set, which is listening ability. And I've talked a lot about listening ability and how to improve it here on the podcast, but what it boils down to in the end is still just more practice. You need to listen an awful lot to train your brain to be able to recognize words, parse sentences, and distinguish sounds, and so on and so forth. So simply listening more and understanding what you're listening to is going to take you very far, making this a good example of horizontal difficulty. So those were 3 examples for each type of difficulty, and as you might have noticed, the vertical difficulty mostly relates to beginners, because there is a certain trend here that when you start doing something, it tends to be vertically difficult, but once you know how it works, it's mostly a matter of doing the same thing over and over, such as in the case of learning characters, and then it becomes more horizontal. If we were to look at a Chinese learning journey from beginner through intermediate and up to advanced, I would dare say that Chinese is almost entirely horizontal. There is a certain hump you need to get over as a beginner when you learn tones and when you learn how the writing system works, but after that, most of the challenges you faced will have horizontal difficulty, not vertical. I think the type of difficulty also has an impact on the method you use for tackling that challenge. For horizontal difficulty, the most crucial factor is how much time you spend, so finding methods that you like and are willing to invest a lot of time in might be more important than other considerations. Naturally, since you have a very long way to go, you also want to make sure that your method is efficient, i.e. you get a lot of result for the time that you do invest. And this was something we discussed in Should You Use an Efficient Method for Learning Chinese Even If You Hate It?, which was episode 137. In contrast, when you encounter a challenge with vertical difficulty, the method is important because it makes it possible to succeed in the first place. So it's more about effectiveness than efficiency, in other words. A good method is one that allows you to improve, whereas a bad one might not get you anywhere. Let's use pronunciation as an example here. You could try to learn tones by reading the pinyin in your textbook aloud over and over, but this would be horribly ineffective, and any kind of success you might see will be despite of your method, not thanks to it. If you instead choose another method and focus on listening intently, mimicking, and getting feedback, you stand a much better chance of learning pronunciation properly. I already mentioned my pronunciation course earlier, which helps you to do this, and it's not an accident that the courses I create tend to focus on these vertically difficult things, because that's where people need the most help, or at least the most explanations or the most encouragement when it comes to tackling these difficult challenges. In these cases, it also matters how you approach these vertically difficult challenges. So just to pick one example from the pronunciation course, I think the order in which you teach and explain sounds matters quite a lot. For example, there are many students who struggle with the J and Q in pinyin, and that is because they haven't been taught this properly and they are focusing on the hardest sounds first, or not necessarily first, but without having mastered the more basic parts. So if you break down the sounds J and Q, and you can see this if you use IPA, it's actually very easy. It's just a stop, which would be similar to, say, D or T in pinyin, although a slightly different tongue position, and then followed by the X sound, which most people can make, it's not that hard, and then it's either aspirated or not aspirated, which you do know if you know the difference between, say, D and T. So when designing the pronunciation course, I made sure to really think about what is the easiest thing to teach first, make sure you know that, and then you build on that to learn something that is slightly more difficult and relies on what you learned earlier. And then when you get to J and Q, it isn't so bad because you know all the components and the parts already, you just need to put them together. And that doesn't mean that pronunciation becomes magically easy to learn suddenly. It's not meant to be a cheap sales pitch in that sense. But my hope is, of course, that it becomes easier or less difficult at least. So to conclude this episode, yes, learning Chinese is difficult, but I don't think it's difficult in the way that most people think. Because what most people think about when they say that something is difficult is probably that it's difficult in the sense that scaling a wall is difficult, not that walking a long distance is difficult. And having learned and taught Chinese now for well over 15 years, I think that most of the difficulty with learning Chinese is horizontal, not vertical. Like I said, there is a beginner bump, which certainly isn't horizontal, where it feels like everything is super hard. But once you're past that, the slope flattens out a bit and difficulty becomes more horizontal. And remember, that doesn't mean it becomes easy, it just means it's difficult in a different way. And that might require a different approach. If you want more structured help getting over the beginner bump, you can check out Unlocking Chinese, which is my course for beginners, which includes all the things that I think I would have liked to know as a beginner, including both things about the language itself, such as characters, words, grammar, and so on, and also how to learn these things. And if you're not interested in a course, there are roughly 500 articles on Hacking Chinese, and many of them deal with beginner issues. And there's also a specific page for beginners, which I will link to in the description. So to summarize, learning Chinese requires time and effort, and most people who fail to learn Chinese do so because there are too many steps, not because of a specific step being too hard. This is encouraging because it means that anyone can learn Chinese. You don't need superpowers, talents, or anything like that. You just need commitment and perseverance. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.